Please, doctor, stay with me." The words slipped out of Sophie like a secret she had kept too long. They were small, wet with sleep and fever, and something like a child's plea. Brief, honest, impossible to take back. Her fingers curled around the fabric of the blanket and found a hand that was larger, steady, cool against the trembling of her own. The hospital room held its breath. The machines behind them were a distant, steady tide. The fluorescent light hummed above. The night nurse moved quietly at the cross of the corridor. Outside, the city kept existing in its indifferent way. Inside, the world narrowed to the single truth in Sophie's chest. She did not want to be alone. Then the scene blurred into an earlier afternoon, a different light, a different kind of urgency. The memory unspooled with a softer noise, the smell of antiseptic, the clink of a pen, the hush of a small waiting room. Sophie had told herself for weeks that she could manage this alone. She had told herself the weight in her ribs was just too much coffee, too little sleep, too many nights reading until the book fell from her fingers. She worked at a second-hand bookstore sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a cafe that always smelled like caramel and rain. Her days were tidy in the way of people who liked order, reshelving paperbacks according to the proprietor's stubborn system, writing the titles that came into her head on the chalkboard out front, stamping the shop's loyalty cards with an almost ritualistic exactness. She liked other people's stories best of all. She could be braver for a character on a page than for herself in mirror light. The clinic was a place she had avoided for years. The thought of sitting in a small room under a pale lamp and answering personal questions had a way of making her cheeks hot, her palms slippery. Yet the ache in her chest began to trade in excuses for urgency. One late autumn morning, the sky a flat pewter, leaves like old coins on the sidewalk, she walked into the clinic with a fistful of courage and a stomach that churned with dread. He was there because he was supposed to be, a practiced calm in a crisp white coat. Daniel Hayes had the sort of face magazine photographers made soft focus. It was defined, not sharp, with a slow smile that suggested patience more than charm. He introduced himself as if to a colleague, and then again, gentler, to Sophie. His voice was the kind that sat beside you rather than asking you to move first. He had kind hands, the sort that handled a chart with respect and a patient silence with an ease that made people feel like they could breathe. Sophie, who had rehearsed what she would say until it came out wrong in her head, mostly listened. She told him the small things, the nights when sleep fled, the afternoons when her heart thudded too loud, and the larger thing that she was ashamed to name. She was tired of being afraid. She heard herself speak and wanted to catch each word before it tumbled. Daniel's eyes did not flicker away. He asked questions, clear, soft, and when she needed a moment, he waited without crowding. There was professionalism there, yes, but there was something else, a human steadiness she had not expected. When she left, she felt raw and a little lighter. Outside, the city smelled of rain and frying onions. She walked to the bookstore and told no one. Her coworker Mia gave her a look over the counter, the kind that asked questions without words. Sophie pasted a smile over the remainder of the day and reshelved a box of romance novels. She liked pleased endings on paper. In life, endings were messier. Their second meeting happened by accident. The cafe across from the bookstore had a cracked window and a regular lineup of people who lived by the slow ritual of coffee. Sophie had chosen a table near the window, a book open but untouched, her palms folded around a cup that was more a shield than comfort. Daniel arrived with a quiet confidence she was beginning to recognize, and, to her surprise, he sat at the table across from her. He didn't look like he had noticed at first. Then he offered the tentative smile of someone testing permission, and Sophie offered one back that was almost a reflex. They talked in the way people do when they are trying not to say how much the moment matters. Small things, the shop's new shipments, the weather, the comfort of a book that matched your mood. Daniel revealed in fragments the idea that he liked working with people more than his title suggested. He made it clear he wasn't the sort of man who wanted headlines. Sophie, in turn, let the conversation skirt the edges of appraisal and curiosity. He wasn't condescending. He listened like someone who wanted to know the actual answer rather than the answer that would make for pleasant small talk. A week later, the city came between them in the form of a headline Sophie had not meant to see. She was at the back counter, stamping a loyalty card, when a customer left a newspaper folded like a secret on the table near the door. The headline was crisp and unavoidable. Hayes Medical Group founder expands philanthropy, profile. For a second, she couldn't place the name. Then the photograph pulled memory into focus. The same composed face, the same slow smile. The article was glossy and careful, full of charts of success, of foundations and renovations and donations. The picture showed Daniel being awarded a ribbon at a hospital opening, handshake captured like a final note in a press release. He was, the story said, a man who had built an empire from tenacity and intelligence. The text quoted colleagues who spoke of his vision and commitment in the kind of language that sat at the top of the world and made a gentle slope down. Sophie felt the floor tilt. She had a picture in her mind that was clean, someone who was kind and near, someone who could make a mess of a conversation but then leave you smiling. The headline filled the space between them with glass. It made her think of the smallness of her own life in ways she hadn't allowed herself to feel aloud. Her single-room apartment above a laundromat, the way she worried about the rent at the end of the month, the habit she had of measuring her worth against the neatness of other people's lives. The knowledge of his wealth did not make him less kind. It made him complicated, and complexity felt like a question her shy heart was not ready to answer. She began to withdraw. It was not a theatrical departure, but a series of small silences, a delayed reply, a missed coffee, a canceled plan. She told herself she was protecting herself from something: humiliation, the ache of feeling unworthy. The avoidance soothed for a while. She turned back to the books and the rituals, letting fingers find familiar spines and words she could trust. But absence has a sound. It is loud in the places people used to live. It makes the familiar seem like a theater where the other actor has forgotten their cue. Daniel noticed, of course. He was not the sort to disappear when someone mattered. He practiced restraint in a way that made it clear he understood the lines of his profession as well as the lines of ordinary decency. He continued to come to the cafe at odd hours, always the same table by the window, always careful to keep the conversation light. He left small things, a book he thought Sophie would like, a paper bag with a pastry when he knew the shop would be hectic. He respected the distance she asked for. There were nights he would walk the stretch past the bookstore and make a show of buying silence from a street vendor only to drink the quiet alone. Sophie hated herself a little for letting worry make her choices. She imagined their lives as two parallel tracks that would last forever. His polished, measured by quarterly reports and gala invitations, hers raw and lined with thrift store tags. The knowledge that someone she liked, someone kind, inhabited a world she didn't belong to felt like a fault. She began a series of tiny compromises that felt more like betrayals. She avoided the clinic follow-ups. She minimized his texts that were patient, not pushy. She told herself that distance was the safe option, and safety, if nothing else, was something she understood how to build. The city watched these things as if they were small, forgettable episodes. It had little interest in the private geometry of two people learning the contours of one another. A week stretched, a month. The small gestures he made became steadier fixtures in the periphery of her life. A bookmark slipped into a book she had placed on display, a message asking if she needed anything after a late shift. Each kindness balanced on the edge of something she couldn't name. Daniel had reasons to exercise caution beyond the obvious. He had learned, the hard way, that generosity could be mistaken for access. Years before, he'd given of himself freely to someone who had been more interested in the trappings than the person. That relationship had left him with a choice-bound heart and a fear that affection tied to wealth would always be conditional. He carried that history like an old scar, a memorial of judgment and tenderness, and it made him watchful and careful. When a woman walked away, he didn't roar after her. He sat and read the silence until it felt less thunderous. Sophie suspected none of that. What she felt was the new vulnerability of being seen. It had lived in her like an insect tapping at the inside of a jar. Seeing it was both relief and terror. The more she tried to tamp it down, the louder it grew. To protect herself, she started accepting the hollow safety of small, solitary victories. Making it through a Saturday shift, going to bed without ruminating for an hour first. The victories were thin. She wanted a bigger map for her life, but didn't know where to ask for one. The distance continued until the day her body stopped answering the rules. It was a bright afternoon, the kind of day that made light seem like paper thrown across storefronts. Sophie had worked a double shift. The shop had been busier than usual. Collections of students and freelancers had clustered around the mismatched chairs, and the register had rung its small bell until her wrists ached. She had drunk too little water. She had eaten a pastry on an empty stomach because it was the fastest fix available. Anxiety had been pulsing at the edges of her vision all week, but she had learned to keep it folded beneath practicalities. That afternoon, it refused to be folded. She left the store with a stack of returned books under one arm and a tote of evening groceries slung over the other. The street moved around her in that blurry, cinematic way that makes you feel like you're watching your life on a slightly delayed screen. A couple arguing gently on the corner, a cyclist weaving, a dog whose owner kept apologizing. Sophie felt heat push into her face. Her vision ping-ponged between clear and fogged. She tried to take a breath and found that the air caught like a fishhook. The first sign was a staggering step. She braced with one hand on the bookstore window and laughed at herself, the sound tiny and brittle. Then the world swayed, and the cement rushed up. The books tumbled from her arms and stilled like something else entirely. The city contracted into a single sound, someone gasping, and the rest fell away. Someone called 911. A woman who was carrying a stroller dropped it and ran. A barista from the cafe, apron swinging, crouched beside Sophie and pressed a hand to the back of her neck. Voices braided. "Hey, stay with us. Keep her talking. Can you hear me?" The world became a series of hands. Another person unbuttoning the collar of her blouse. A stranger applying pressure to a shallow cut on her knee. Someone wrapping a coat around her. Daniel saw the flash of white as he crossed the street. His attention snagged as if some interior wire tightened. He was visiting the cafe, the way he sometimes did after seeing Sophie at the bookshop, never imposing, always on the edges. He had paused to glance toward the bookstore when the sound happened, a prickle at the base of his skull that made him move without thinking. By the time he reached the scene, the sidewalk had gathered a halo of people. Sophie lay half-curled, her breaths a stray animal. Someone was speaking to her, but she seemed both present and beyond the reach of sound. He knelt because it was the fastest thing he could do. Hands that had been steady with charts and schedules were suddenly involved in more urgent human calculus. He recognized signs he had not wanted to: pallor, damp brow, a listless flutter of the eyelids. He cleared a little space with the surgical efficiency he'd cultivated over a decade in operating rooms and clinics, And then he waited for the paramedics, because that was the line he would never cross, treating on the curb when a hospital was 30 minutes away. He had seen too often what pride in action could do. His hand brushed Sophie's shoulder just once, a contact meant as presence and nothing more. It was the old, truest form of being there. The paramedics arrived, professional and brisk, moving like people who had rehearsed empathy and practiced its logistics. They checked vitals through a choreography of practiced motions, their questions clipped but steady. "Do you know your name? Can you tell us where you are?" She answered in fragments, syllables trapped like birds. They loaded her into the ambulance with the careful speed of people who had done this before. He was at the hospital before the tape of the ambulance doors had fully shut. He signed his name on the intake form with the small flourish of a man who always filled in paperwork carefully. The night nurse away on her rounds eased a stretcher through a corridor lit with buzzing fluorescents and soft overheads that made everything feel simultaneously intimate and clinical. In the hallway, Sophie was a blur of white blanket and forehead bead sweat. Her fingers reached for fewer things now. They curled reflexively around the hems of the blanket as if it could anchor her to staying. There was a moment then when everything stretched thin. Daniel felt like an actor moving through a scene he'd been trying on for years. His professional instincts lined up against something more primitive and fierce. He could do the duties of a physician here in the public way necessity prescribed. He could take a seat just out of the line of clinical protocol and wait, an attentive observer rather than an intruder. He would let the nurses and doctors do their work. He would keep his hands to himself when it mattered, because boundaries were not mere rules, they were promises of safety for the person on the bed. Sophie hovered at consciousness like someone listening to a conversation through a wall. When her eyelids finally parted, the room filled with people moving in the clinical dance of triage and care. Monitors blinked. Someone adjusted an IV. A nurse with soft eyes asked questions and lowered her voice. Pain had left a thin trail across Sophie's face. It had not yet smoothed into vulnerability, but it had softened like cloth in rain. Daniel stood in the doorway because that was how he managed himself, present but not impinging. She blinked and found him where she had met him first, the same composed face, the same kind eyes. Her throat made a little sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Hi," she whispered, and it was less a greeting than the admission of surprise that he had been the one to appear at the end of the street and again at the hospital. He refused to sit too close. He was aware of the cameras of nursing protocol and the modesty required of a physician. "You gave us a scare," he said quietly. "You're going to be fine. They've given you fluids and checked everything. They'll keep you here for observation." He spoke the way one might steady a leaning ladder, practical and deliberate. Sophie felt ridiculous for needing his proximity, and more ridiculous still that she wanted it. She tried to protest, to make light of the situation, but the words came out dry. Her fingers, searching, found his. She didn't let go. The contact was not romantic in the sense of invitation. It was a fistful of humanity. Her palm was hot and weak. His hand was the same steady thing it had always been. It felt like a lever used not to move a world, but to stop it tilting. "Please, doctor, stay with me." The words again, gentle and thin as paper. They were not manipulation. They were not pleading for anything beyond presence. They were a small, sovereign thing, a human asking another human to keep vigil. He hesitated in the way someone respects a threshold. Professional lines were not gestures. They were safety rails he had chosen to keep because he had seen what ignoring them could do. He had a lifetime of seeing the aftermath of overreach. And yet here, faced with the tremor of someone who had been brave enough to ask, something in him did not want to leave. He remained in the doorway. He kept his body angled in a way that said, "I am present," and nothing more. He spoke softly about what would happen next, about follow-ups and rest, and someone who would ensure her discharge. "I'll check in when you wake," he said, "but only as a friend." It was a line spoken with the thought of stewardship and the weight of ethics. It was a promise both to her and to himself, to be the kind of presence that respects autonomy. That protected but fragile arrangement changed nothing for the city and yet everything for the two of them. For Sophie, having someone refuse to leave simply because she asked was like a clean hand on a window. She had uplifted the glass with a hope she hadn't dared to name. For Daniel, staying within the boundary he had stated felt like the first honest thing he'd done since the scar of betrayal had set its rules in his heart. But life is rarely satisfied with single moments. The headline and the withdrawal, the small kindnesses and the professional restraint, they were pieces of an arrangement that had displaced something larger, fear and longing locked in the same chest. Too many threads were left untied. They looped around decisions yet to be made, around boundaries to be honored or reconsidered. After the initial rush of care, Sophie was admitted for observation. The doctors and nurses did their tasks with the practiced rhythm of people who have held other lives in their hands. She slept in fits and starts, the monitors like small honest alarms that did not let her hide. Daniel appeared in the doorway once, twice, always careful to speak to the nurse and make his presence known so no one could misread his reason for being there. The staff took his visits in stride. He was, after all, a physician with a vested interest in patient care. He filled out the forms everyone asked him to fill and took his seat at an appropriate distance. Word of her collapse trickled back to the bookshop and the cafe. Mia visited the hospital with a thermos of instant coffee and a face that held more worry than she was accustomed to showing. Regulars and coworkers sent messages and flowers. For Sophie, the gifts were less important than the idea that people saw her. Being seen was a currency she had undervalued until it became the only thing she could trade in. As the day folded into evening, someone came to retrieve her things from the bookshop, her tote, her shattered stack of returns. The owner wrote a note and left it on her pillow. The city outside the hospital windows shifted from brusque day to the softer, guilty tones of night. Lights blinked across the skyline, and lights inside the ward held faint halos, as if the place were a map of care made manifest. Daniel texted her once that evening. A simple message, no more intrusive than a bookmark tucked into a book. "Hope you're resting. Let me know if you need anything." Sophie read it 3 times. She typed and deleted an answer, and finally wrote, "Thank you. Knowing you were there helped." She nearly hit send, and then did. The act of sending it felt like confessing to herself that his presence had mattered more than she had allowed. He replied with an emoji, then something more. "Take your time. No pressure. I'll be around." The punctuation in his message felt like a hand on the small gap between them, gentle, patient. It dissolved the insistence that distance was the only protective strategy. The hospital became a strange kind of liminal space where change could be arranged without the everyday noise of life getting in the way. Nurses came and went, doctors made notes, Sophie napped and woke and learned the rhythm of eating again without immediate anxiety. She practiced breathing the way therapists suggested, and then abandoned the formal breathing for the messy, grateful inhales when sunlight found the blinds. Over the next weeks, Daniel's presence remained consistent but appropriate. He did not barge into her room as a lover might in a storybook. Instead, he sat across the hall in the visitor's chair, half reading a journal and letting the scenes of his everyday life remain private until the patient care formalities were concluded. When she was discharged, he ensured the transition felt like an escort rather than a takeover. He picked up a prescription the nurse had recommended, but let the pharmacy person speak the directions. He spoke with her about follow-up appointments and ensured the clinic scheduled them at times she could manage. Even then, Sophie kept her walls. Trust was a muscle that had not been used. She wanted to believe in the constancy of a person who showed up without making promises he wouldn't keep. She wanted to believe she could be chosen without being slowly transformed into a project. She had, for so long, believed that being chosen required neither work nor honesty. It required a pre-packaged version of herself that fit another's idea of what was worthy. She began to check her own motives in a way that surprised her. When Daniel brought flowers, not extravagant, just a small bouquet of wildflowers he said reminded him of the bookstore's back shelf, she felt guilty for the pleasure the gesture elicited. When he asked to meet at the cafe, she agreed and then almost canceled at the last minute. Each meeting became an exercise in audacity, showing up when she wanted to hide, responding when the instincts said run. Daniel, too, had his nights of considering what to do next. He told himself, sometimes in the parking lot before he walked into the cafe, that the right thing would be to keep his distance. The wrong thing would be to confuse kindness with a right to intimacy. He had watched other people's lives bend under the weight of expectations, and those old, thorny experiences had taught him the fine edges of generosity. He had not come from money, he had built what he had through work and stubbornness, and he was aware of how wealth could unsettle the fragile balance between two ordinary lives. But there was something about Sophie he couldn't shake. It wasn't the neatness of her routines or the way she stacked books by color sometimes, though those things he noticed. It was the honesty she carried in the softest of ways, the way she said thank you with a gravity that made the world seem kinder for a moment. It was the way she looked at people, not with appraisal, but with a weird, careful affection. Daniel, too, had his nights of considering what to do next. He told himself, sometimes in the parking lot before he walked into the cafe, that the right thing would be to keep his distance. The wrong thing would be to confuse kindness with a right to intimacy. He had watched other people's lives bend under the weight of expectations, and those old, thorny experiences had taught him the fine edges of generosity. He had not come from money, he had built what he had through work and stubbornness, and he was aware of how wealth could unsettle the fragile balance between two ordinary lives. But there was something about Sophie he couldn't shake. It wasn't the neatness of her routines or the way she stacked books by color sometimes, though those things he noticed. It was the honesty she carried in the softest of ways, the way she said thank you with a gravity that made the world seem kinder for a moment. It was the way she looked at people, not with appraisal, but with a weird, careful affection. Those small things rippled into something larger in him, overturning the caution he had trained into his bones. And still he stayed within the boundaries he had promised. He told himself that the bedrock of any potential relationship was the respect for agency, for a woman's right to choose when she wanted closeness and how. For the next weeks they fell into a rhythm that was less about nights of candlelight and more about the quiet accumulation of acts. Daniel delivering a book he thought she'd love. Sophie showing him the part of the bookstore that smelled like old paper and lilacs. Both of them making room for awkward silences that did not have to be filled with performance. Their lives twined in the margins. The cafe became a neutral space for cautious conversation. The bookstore's back room, under a filament bulb that made everything glow soft and forgiving, became their refuge for awkward confessions. They read to each other sometimes, a passage from a text or a line that had stuck in the throat, and they listened with a kind of reverence for the ordinary. But avoidance had its cost. Sophie, who had learned to manage fear by shrinking, still possessed a reflex for recoil. When a photograph of Daniel at a charity gala cropped up across social feeds, when an acquaintance casually mentioned an initiative he funded, the old script played itself out: shame, dissonance, a widening of the gap. She sometimes imagined herself turning into a pale ghost of someone who could fit into his world. She felt foolish for this, the irrationality of jealousy at a person's success, and she told herself to be better. She attempted to calibrate her responses, to be honest with her insecurities, and to sit with them rather than projecting them onto him. One rainy night, after a conversation had gone deeper than either had expected, Sophie walked home under an umbrella that leaked in one place. She made a decision to call him in the morning, to try to trust instead of retreat. She rehearsed the words in the small fluorescent mirror above her sink. "I will try." The rehearsal steadied her hand enough that she slept. But life, as it often does, did not align itself with rehearsals. 2 days later, she found herself at the edge of her capacity again. A slow erosion of sleep and nourishment, and the underlying strain of existing in a world that had not always been kind. She stood on the bookstore's threshold and realized, with a jolt, that she could not keep pretending the small, steady encroachments of her anxiety would not one day topple her. The recognition was not a dramatic revelation so much as a whisper that became a shout. She needed help on terms she could accept. She wrote Daniel a note the way one writes a line in a novel and hopes it will land. "I am scared. I don't want to lose you." She wrestled with whether she was asking for safety or permission, and when she pressed send, she felt like someone who had committed to a cliff jump without knowing the water below. He replied that same hour, with simplicity and no assumption. "Meet me at the cafe in 30 if you want. If not, that's okay too." She went. They talked for longer than either expected. She told him about the nights she stayed up thinking her heart would betray her. He told her, in measured pieces, about the kind of loneliness that came from being looked at for what you had rather than who you were. He admitted that his past had taught him to be wary of kindness that masqueraded as favor. He told her, quietly, the short version of a story that had left a mark, a relationship where his generosity had been counted as currency rather than care. He called that experience a lesson and nothing more, and then he looked at her with a softness that was not pity. "I don't want to be mistaken," he said. "I want to be chosen. If you ever choose me, I want it to be because you want me." There was a kind of holiness in that sentence, an insistence on mutuality so fierce it was almost simple. Sophie could have run. She could have done the reflex of shrinking that had kept her safe so often. Instead, she listened and let the words settle like a small, honest light. Time passed with small strides. They learned to be awkward together, to tolerate the discomfort of being known without being polished. They had dinners that included third-rate TV and burned toast. They had long silences over good coffee where the silence itself felt companionable. There were setbacks, nights when Sophie retreated into a shell and refused even the smallest outreach. Days when Daniel had to choose where to place his attention between work obligations and the person he was learning to care for. Then the day came when she left the bookstore and the pavement rose like a threat underfoot. Her knees folded with fatigue. A passerby saw her slump and called for help. Hands that had been the size of welcome in small ways became emergency. She was rushed into an ambulance and propelled toward a hospital whose doors had, 2 weeks prior, swallowed another moment of fear. At the hospital, nurses moved with the economy of people who had practiced both tenderness and efficiency. Daniel, who had been waiting in the parking lot like someone afraid to intrude, signed himself in and watched the trolley go by. He moved through the room with restraint, leaving the medical tasks to the team while his presence hovered like a cautious lamp. He held the boundary he had named. He would be there, he would not impose, he would ensure she received care, and he would not use his authority to fast-track affection. He had learned to protect autonomy in others the way he protected it in himself. The quiet of the ward held 1,000 small truths. In that place, he chose to be present as a person who had learned how to wait. The machines were indifferent to the romance of the world beyond their scope. They beeped and blinked, unnoticed in the larger human narrative of two people standing on the same small threshold. Sophie, blinking and fragile, reached for the one hand that felt like a tether. She whispered, small and honest, "Please, doctor, stay with me." Outside, the city kept being indifferent. Inside, time was peculiar and sharp, like glass warmed in hand. The plea hung between them, a hinge now clicked into place. The rest, the clearing of boundaries, the ethical negotiations, the confession that would make everything rearrange, waited on the edge of the next breath. If the whisper had been a request, it was also an opening. If it had been vulnerability, it was also a summons to choose. If you love emotional romance stories like this one, hit like and subscribe. There was a tightness in Sophie's throat as she drifted back toward sleep, the kind that made memory and future compress into a single thin line. Daniel, who had learned to be prudent with his heart, felt something loosen inside him that had been held taut for too long. He stood in the doorway like a guardian and not like a conqueror. He had promised himself he would keep to the rules he knew. He had promised her, and, in a way, himself, that any closeness would only be pursued with full, clear consent, and after all care obligations were respected. The hours that followed in the hospital were careful. Nurses monitored and charted. Sophie slept, sometimes stirring. Daniel sat in the chair by the bed and read an article he did not entirely understand, his thoughts skittering back to the palm he had held, and to a past that had taught him to keep his hands where they could not coerce. He had no intention of abusing the thin intimacy of the moment. To stay with her meant to be responsible and respectful. As the evening swelled toward night, Sophie's mind floated among fragments, his face, the safety of his presence, her own fear of not being enough for someone with a life so far from her own. She had not asked for miracles, she had asked for presence. The distinction mattered. When morning light came through the blinds, it painted the room in honest colors. The world outside marched on. The story in which they had become characters was only beginning. There were still decisions to be made and rules to be honored. She would have to reconcile her own sense of worth without depending on the constancy of another's gaze. He would have to be vigilant about the line between care and personal desire. The whisper had changed something, not by making everything tidy, but by making it visible. And yet, the turning point had not dissolved the complexities. There would be follow-up visits, quiet conversations, and the slow, sometimes tedious work of building trust. The city outside their window would keep being loud and indifferent. Inwardly, both of them would have to do the tedious job of learning what it meant to be chosen willingly and to choose in return. Sophie closed her eyes and, before sleep swallowed her again, thought of the small, ordinary things she wanted. The smell of rain on a pavement, the crackle of a thrift store page, the sound of someone waiting without trying to fix. She held, for a fragile moment, the sense that being chosen might not be a destiny assigned by wealth or station, but something made in the steady, patient agreement of two people. When the nurse checked her chart and the doctor told the ward they'd keep her for observation and then discharge if things continued to stabilize, those arrangements sounded like small miracles. They were not glamorous, they were practical and bound in the mundane. Her phone buzzed once more, a message from Daniel. No grand pronouncements, just a line that read, "Here if you need. No pressure, ever." It was a line that kept the promise of boundaries intact and offered itself like a bridge. She smiled, small and private, and let the thin pleasure wash down her throat. The story was far from concluded. There were more conversations to be had, more boundaries to test and respect, and the slow work of trust to continue. But for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt a margin of space in which she might learn to be chosen without being consumed. The plea had been made. The choice, for both of them, had only just begun. If this story touched you, please subscribe, ring the notification bell, and tell us in the comments, would you stay in that doorway if someone you care for asked you to? Days folded into each other with a kind of merciful ordinariness. The hospital visit that had once felt like a chasm became for Sophie a hinge around which the rest of her life turned a fraction. She attended follow-up appointments, she learned to hydrate on schedule, to let rest be something she didn't earn. Sometimes she failed spectacularly, forgot a water bottle, took on a double shift, but she returned to the small practices that made steadiness possible. Daniel did what he had promised in both action and spirit. He handed the clinic team a clear note. He would no longer be Sophie's treating physician. He arranged for another doctor to oversee her follow-ups and made sure the nurses knew he was there only as a friend. When he spoke about it with Sophie, his voice was careful and explicit. "I want this to be fair," he said once, over coffee that tasted like burnt sugar and safety. "I can't be the one making medical decisions or using my name to change what you deserve. If this grows, if it ever grows into something, let it be because you chose the person, not the title." She watched him perform the small bureaucratic kindnesses and felt something inside unclench. There was a kind of bravery in his refusal to use advantage. It made room for trust, not obligation. And trust, as Sophie came to realize, was work. It was a muscle they both had to practice. The early months were not cinematic. They were a compilation of ordinary days that felt slowly miraculous precisely because of their predictability. Daniel delivered a bag of mismatched muffins on a Wednesday because he knew the shop would be understaffed. Sophie made him sit under a filament bulb in the bookstore's back room and choose 3 titles he would never otherwise pick. She watched him read passages and noticed the little things that made his face soften. They learned how to hold silence without interpreting it as disinterest. There were awkward moments, too. Sophie sometimes recoiled when a charity gala photograph of Daniel reappeared on her feed. She flinched at descriptions of projects whose scale made her feel temporarily small. Daniel, sensing the shadow, never dismissed her feeling with the ease of someone who thought money solved internal arithmetic. Instead, he asked about it, offhand and gentle, and listened as she named the specific sting. He never offered money as panacea. He offered time, presence, and the frankly harder task of humility. "Tell me," he told her once, lowering his voice so no one at the cafe could overhear, "what makes you feel small? I want to know so I can stop doing it." She surprised herself by telling him. She told him about her childhood of thrift store dresses and apartments with temperamental heaters, about the way she rehearsed apologies when she bought something expensive because she felt undeserving of comfort. He sat with that and offered no pat answer. What he offered instead were small, steady gestures. He asked advice about the bookstore's layout. He helped carry boxes when a delivery came. He celebrated the tiny things with ridiculous enthusiasm, an act of kindness that felt like re-education. Sophie took up therapy for the first time seriously, not because Daniel told her to, but because a quiet, patient person across a table had suggested it, and Sophie realized she wanted tools that weren't others' kindnesses. The therapy sessions were ordinary and hard. There were no miraculous lines of revelation, only hours of practice at looking at fear and naming it, of learning how to ask for support and accept it without apology. Daniel never attended these sessions with her. He didn't need to. He sat instead in the waiting area sometimes, reading a magazine upside down, giving her the space to do the internal work without his gaze. A year is an encapsulation of weather, rain that arrives with a pattern, winters that leave a mark, summers that teach the body to remember fruit. As months passed, their lives threaded together across small things. Daniel learning the precise way Sophie liked her tea, Sophie learning the cadence of Daniel's worries when a clinic expansion threatened to pull him away. There were arguments that resolved into apologies, and apologies that learned how to be more specific. He spoke frankly about his fear of being seen as a donor first and a person second. She spoke, often haltingly, about her fear that affection would be conditional. They did not fix the world. They learned instead how to trace the contour of each other's wounds without assuming they could heal them for good. There were moments of public tenderness that felt like privacy. Once, during a rainstorm, the cafe's awning leaked in a conspicuous drip above their table. Daniel produced an umbrella with a ridiculous flourish, and the barista clapped in the way baristas clap for small theatricality. Sophie laughed until she felt silly, and in that laugh there was relief, the version of herself who could be spontaneous without collapse. Another evening, he accompanied her to a low-key community book reading and sat in the back, watching as she read a passage out loud. His clap afterward was the first one she had wanted without confusion. He continued to be meticulous about boundaries. When a journalist reached out for a puff piece about the man who loves books and buys hospitals and wanted to visit the bookstore, Daniel declined. He suggested instead a small profile that focused on Sophie's work as a bookseller, the way she organized charity drives and taught children story hours. To those who saw the world in neat moral arcs, the gesture might have looked like patronage. To Sophie, it felt like respect. He was willing to be quiet and supportive, even when silence would have been less glamorous. There were tests. An illness in Sophie's family required she take unpaid leave to help care for a parent. The logistics of rent and time pushed against the soft scaffolding they had built. Daniel offered assistance. No fanfare, no press release, only a handful of checks and the arrangement of a payment plan that kept dignity in the center. Sophie accepted this help after a week of arguing with herself and 2 nights of crying into a pillow. She set conditions for herself. The money would be a loan, repaid when she stabilized. She would resume the normal schedule when she could. Daniel accepted the terms with the lightness of someone who had learned what true generosity felt like, invisible until it needed to be named. Their intimacy, too, matured in fitful, honest increments. There was a scene one evening in Sophie's apartment where he taught her how to make a proper omelet, and she responded by teaching him how to patch a pair of thrifted jeans. Their hands touched across a counter while reaching for the same spatula. The contact felt like permission that neither of them had demanded. They kissed once, slow and clumsy, sitting on a stoop beneath a street lamp that hummed like a distant insect. It was not the fevered climax of a romance novel, but the beginning of something that could hold boredom and joy alike. When she later flinched at his quickness, saying, "I need more time," he did not complain with grand sorrow. He said instead, "Take it. I'm not leaving anything to chance." That consistency became a language in itself. As the first anniversary of their meeting approached, a day Sophie marked only by the memory that a little courage had once brought her to a clinic, Daniel wanted to do something that would feel like them, modest, public, honest. He did not want a dramatic declaration. He wanted a question that acknowledged all of it, the ethics, the collapses, the slow repair. The cafe where they'd first sat was a natural place. It had the crack in the window and the regulars who liked to watch things grow rather than stage them. He knew it would be unglamorous and therefore perfect. The morning he planned to ask, it rained soft as papery notes. Sophie came to work with her hair in a loose twist, fingers marked faintly with ink from a long day of labeling returns. The shop smelled like lemon oil and old paper. Daniel arrived with a small paper bag and a look that was both calm and slightly nervous, a fissure of vulnerability under his practiced composure. He asked if she could step outside for a moment. She did, because the years had taught her to trust the invitations that didn't demand. The street had a hush to it, A delivery truck hummed past, and a dog tugged its owner on the opposite curb. Daniel took both of her hands. There was no ring in his fingers yet. This wasn't theater. Instead, he spoke as if naming something he'd been studying for months. "I don't want to solve what makes you afraid," he said. "I don't want to be the person who buys away your discomfort. I want to be someone who chooses to stay when it is hard, and who listens when you tell me to step back. I want to be someone who asks for consent and respects your answer. Sophie, will you marry me?" There was an ache in the hush that felt like a held breath across a room. The city, that indifferent thing outside the bubble of the bookstore, went on. Sophie looked at his face and saw the tiredness he carried that belonged to him and not to his money, the scar of earlier misreadings, the quiet earnestness that had been patient and constant. She thought of the nights she'd signed away safety to run, of the months where he had stepped back rather than step in, of the test where he had refused the shortcut of privilege. She thought of the way her own world had grown by inches into something less small. "Yes," she said, with a laugh that broke like light. It wasn't the emphatic cry of overnight certainty. It was softer, a steady sound. "Yes," she said again, because the first yes felt too much like surrender, and the second felt like a choice. They married in a small ceremony in a park near the bookstore. There were no chandeliers, no speeches by television personalities, only a circle of friends and family, a brick path, and a person who read a line from a book they both loved. Daniel wore a tie with a tiny, cheerful pattern. Sophie carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers that had once arrived in a paper bag. He repeated, in front of witnesses who had seen their awkward months and their small victories, the promise he had made in the doorway of an antiseptic room, to choose her without buying her, to remain present without pressuring, to value consent as sacred. They did not leave their struggles behind at the altar. There were setbacks, of course, weeks where Sophie retreated into old fears, and weeks where Daniel's schedule threatened to overwhelm him. But the scaffolding they had built, explicit boundaries, therapy, shared language for fear, a habit of rehearsal for trust, helped them name the small failures and repair them. They learned to apologize with detail and to forgive with patience. They argued about money spreadsheets in one room and read aloud to each other in another. They held each other's hands through griefs that had nothing to do with each other and through joys that were small and luminous. Years later, when a young woman walked into the bookstore with a fistful of courage and a face like an open question, Sophie watched her with familiar tenderness. She folded a forward in a copy of a novel and tucked it onto a shelf with a light caught the spine. Daniel waited outside with an umbrella. Sophie caught his eye and nodded, the small private language of the two of them. When the woman paused and looked uncertain at the clinic flyer pinned to the community board, Sophie told her a story, not of grand gestures, but of slow regard, of lines kept and promises kept, of a hand that had stayed in the doorway when asked. The woman smiled, in that way reserved for people who imagined softer possibilities. The whispered plea that had once been